Hello and welcome to our webinar entitled The Dangers of Accepting Informal Lease Extensions. My name's Louis Burns and I'm the Managing Director of Leasehold Solutions. In the following webinar we're going to explain in some detail many of the pitfalls that you would face if you accepted something that your freeholder is usually very keen to offer at the time you make a move to extend your lease using your statutory legal rights, and it's called an informal or non-statutory lease extension. It's worth mentioning before we start here that if you're a flat owner, you have a legal right, if you've owned your flat for 2 or more years, to extend your lease by an additional 90 years and reduce your ground rent to 0. And we're going to explain why that's the very last thing your freeholder wants you to do. We call these informal lease extension offers Trojan horse offers. And that's because they're made to look like a gift. The freeholder presents it in a way that he's saving you some money, he's doing some kind of deal with you, and it seems like a gift. But when you actually look inside, when you look at the detail of what's being offered, you realise it's not really a gift. And the implications of accepting informal lease extensions can be very, very serious for a flat owner. So in our slide you've just seen, we thought the best way of presenting the implications of an informal lease extension were first of all work out a real life lease extension on a flat somewhere in London. And you can see that our flat that we've chosen is a flat with a lease length of 75 years remaining and a value on that flat of about £230,000. So you can see the cost of extending that lease is just over £13,000, including the legal fees. And that's made up in 3 different ways of ground rent, reversion and marriage value. So we've done that calculation, and if that was your flat today, it would cost you just over £13,000 to extend your lease. I just make a point here that the reason that the legal fees are so hard is, unfortunately, the law says that as well as you having to pay for your own legal and valuation fees, you are legally obliged to also pay the reasonable legal and valuation fees of your multimillionaire freeholder. And so that pushes the cost up quite a lot. But if we use that as a yardstick, that if you were to exert your statutory legal right to extend your lease, you would pay just over £13,000, and you would get a lease extension of an additional 90 years. So you would have a lease with 165 years left on the lease, and you would have 0 ground rent for the remainder of your lease. And that would be you exerting your legal right for a lease extension. Now, once you've served a Section 42 notice, which is you exerting your legal right for your lease extension, which has been created by law and also laws passed to protect your interests around that, your freeholder then decides to make their move. Now, you'd imagine that a freeholder getting £10,000 for a lease extension would be quite a gift and they'd be quite happy with it. But in actual fact, the very opposite is true, because they've worked out some ways to get maybe 10 times that amount of money from you over a period of time. And so what they will do is they will contact you and say, okay, we've got your notice, but why bother with all that? Why bother, carrying out this legal process and you paying our fees and your fees and it taking a year to do? We're nice guys. We're really nice guys. We do you a deal because we like you so much. And here's our deal. And they will usually send you a letter like you saw just before I started speaking again here. And the details of that deal will be quite vague, in fact, but they will say something like, I'll extend your lease back up to 99 years and, modernise the ground rent, maybe ground rent £250 a year, it's only £5 a week. And we're not going to do any nasty things to your lease. We're just going to modernise the clause of your lease instead of you paying your fees and our fees, total combined legal fees of maybe £1,200, and you've got 30 days to respond to our offer. So if you do a quick comparison between what we said it would cost you to extend your lease the statutory way, which was just over £13,000, and you look at what they're offering you now, well, they're saving you about £1,700, and they're going to do it very quickly, and there's no fuss, and you're going to save a lot of money in legal fees, and it looks like an absolute deal. It looks like it's something that you should really do. And this is a trick of epic proportions, and at this point you really need to pause and examine the real implications of what they're doing. Bearing in mind that your freeholder is probably a professional freeholder. That means they buy as many freeholds as they can get their hands on, because they make huge amounts of money from you, the flat owner. So they make money from the ground rent that comes into them every month. When people want to extend their lease, they take that gladly. They'll often make money from building insurance, because your lease will insist that they insure the building, and so they make some money. They call it a finder's fee that they make on top of that. Maybe they've got some interest in the running of the building with the service charges. They can make money on that, and also licenses. They make lots of money just for having clauses in that say you have to pay them money if you want to do this, that, or whatever with your flat. So these are professional freeholders who make money, and here they are poised to see if they can make as much money as they can from you right now. So you have to be very careful. So let's examine in a bit more detail the implications of that seemingly brilliant deal. So this ground rent is, for the freeholder, a two-edged sword. In fact, a three-edged sword, if that were possible, because first of all, they are charging you ground rent in their calculation, even though they're not reducing the ground rent to zero. They're actually massively increasing your ground rent. It's still dearer for your informal lease extension than it was for the formal statutory lease extension. So you're paying too much money there for a start. But then your freeholder makes money these two different ways. First of all, and this is the one that kind of everyone can get their head round, is that they're going to make £250 a year. So for the next 10 years, they'll make £2,500 additional on the ground rent that they collect. And then the ground rent doubles, and it will go to £500. So the next 10 years, they'll make another £5,000 of ground rent that they wouldn't have normally. So the freeholders made themselves about £7,500 there, which is very nice for them. The problem is that the key time of a lease on a flat is not actually when the flat goes down to zero, but really the point that you should be really aware of is when your flat goes below 80 years, because if you allow the lease of your flat to drop below 80 years, this third element of a calculation of how you must compensate your freeholder kicks in. It's called marriage value, and it makes the cost of you extending your lease rise quite considerably. So here's the clever thing. The other clever thing that freeholder has done is first of all, they've extended your lease back up to 99 years, meaning in about 17 or 18 years from now, someone's going to have to re-extend that lease. So someone's going to pay them for a new lease extension, and this is money they wouldn't get if you extended your lease the statutory way. But they've done something very clever. So your current ground rent may be something like £80 or £100 a year, and that's part of this calculation that we have to do. And when you extend your lease again, or whoever was unfortunate to own your flat, your ground rent at that point would be getting very close to £1,000 a year. Now, our calculation is when we work out how much ground rent we owe your freeholder for a new lease extension, we have to work out how much ground rent you owe your freeholder for however long your lease is left, including the steps that they've put into this, and then you capitalise it back in today's money. But with a ground rent of £1,000 a year, that is a huge amount of money. And leasehold valuers, when we asked them to do this calculation, suggested that in about 19 years from now, someone would have to pay about £70,000 for a lease extension because of the onerous clauses of the ground rent and obviously increased value of the flat, etc. So here your freeholder has done something really clever. They've got the price of a lease extension, thank you very much. They've made another £7,500 ground rent yield, which they wouldn't have had, and then they get £60,000, £70,000, £75,000 because someone wants to re-extend that lease. So instead of them just getting the money for a lease extension, instead of them getting that £10,000 for that one-off hit and having no future value in the lease extension of your flat, they have manufactured this way. If they can trick you into getting £100,000 over the next 19 years, and by anyone's stretch of the imagination, that's a very good business deal for your freeholder. Not so good for you or whoever is the future person that buys your flat, as a massive part of the equity of the flat will be paid to your freeholder needlessly because of this trick that they've pulled off for you. Just to say that they also, freeholders have other bags of tricks up their sleeve, and it's not always ground rent doubling every 10 years or 20 years. A favourite of freeholders is to have your ground rent doubling every 10 years, maybe £200 a year, doubling every 10 years, and linked to RPI. And RPI is the retail price index. And so in 10 years from now, your ground rent would double to £400, and then someone would go back and calculate each year how much RPI went up. Now, RPI is a method of measuring inflation. So they would see how much it went up each year, and they would apply that retrospectively to your ground rent, and that's how much your ground rent would be. So that is a very onerous clause in the ground rents. Some very, very greedy freeholders will now, we see this more and more, trying to have the ground rent doubling every 5 years, which is totally ridiculous, makes your flat completely unsaleable. You may as well just close it when it's time to go and give it back to your freeholder. Or some of them will say ground rent linked to 0.02% the capital value of your flat, or in fact some of the estates in London say 0.25% the capital value of the estate. So as the property price goes up, some of that value that it increases, it goes onto your ground rent. And if you calculate that house prices in London have doubled every 10 years for the last 80 years, it can have serious implications for your ground rent. So the ground rent clauses are very important. So it's a very clear business model for freeholders, and if you imagine they own hundreds of thousands of flats, some of them are thousands of flats, if they can trick people into having these informals, they make a fortune, and that's why they put so much time and effort into trying to trick you into having it. It's not just financially, though, that you should be aware. There are other things that you need to be aware of when you're considering an informal lease extension. One of those very dangerous things can be the terms of your lease. Now, if you extend your lease by using your legal right, statutory route, it's illegal for your freeholder to intrinsically change any terms of the lease. You are allowed to, and your freeholder is allowed to, try and modernise any defective clauses in the lease, and that's the only allowance the law makes. Not so if you go for an informal lease extension, because you do not have a legal right for this informal lease extension, so it is impossible for the law to protect you. So your freeholder can put in that lease any clause that they want, and they often head that out. If you think back to the letter that we showed you, they often talk about just modernising the terms of the lease, but I can tell you in reality, I'm doing this day in and day out, that those modernisations always benefit them, and there are usually financial implications where they make more money. I'll give you an example. I was speaking a couple of years ago on a project we did in West Ham, and one of the chaps in the audience didn't quite believe what I was saying, and he went to his freeholder and he did some kind of deal for an informal lease extension and stepped out of a group of about 35 people we had going ahead. And he phoned me up about 4 months later to say, I kind of really wish I'd listened now. And the freeholder had put in the terms of his lease a clause, because this chap didn't live in the flat, he rented it out as an investment for him. And the freeholder inserted a clause that said, from now on, when you get your rent, you owe 10% of that rent to us, the freeholder, every month. Obviously, the guy signed it, and now that's his. You never get out of that. You can't change that back afterwards. So now he has to give 10% of the rent of that flat back to the freeholder forevermore. Because one of the other genius things that they're doing here is the freeholder is it just works on so many levels. One of the cash savings they're offering you is the fact that you don't have to pay for your own legal representation. So they're selling the fact to you that you don't have a solicitor protecting your interests as a good way of saving money. So you just go to them, you use their solicitor, their valuer, and you sign the contract. So it's very, very clever. Although it is also worth saying that even if you had a solicitor and they picked up on all these clauses the freeholder was putting in there, you have no legal mechanism to remove those clauses. And so if the freeholder refused to say, no, I want that license in there, then you'd have to withdraw from their offer and then go to statutory lease extension, serve a legal notice and start all over again. And by that time, your lease would have fallen below. So you have to be very careful about licenses that they try and put in there. Things that say, if you rent your flat out, you need permission for us, and that's going to cost you £500 a year. There's a very sad case just happened a few weeks ago where a chap was injured in a motoring accident, and he was paralysed, and he lived in a ground floor flat, and he wanted to have a little ramp, a wooden ramp put there so he could go out, and the freeholder wanted £15,000 for permission to do that. So licenses are a very important thing, but not just licenses, timeframes. Without wanting to sound like a parrot, it is very important to know that you do not have a legal right for an informal lease extension, and by the grace of the will of the freeholder, that's the thing that you get. There is no way to enforce timeframes, and freeholders will often use this to their advantage. Certainly, and I've lost count how many solicitors I've heard laughing about the fact that their freeholder instructed them to offer really good informal lease extensions to flats that were just about to fall below 80 years, only to withdraw them a few days before that drop date. And so the people didn't have time to serve a legal notice, and their flats fell below 80 years. And that meant the freeholders made much more money when they did that. So oftentimes freeholders will withdraw offers if you're going below 80 years. And there's a rather awful freeholder that we work against, a huge one in London. And they will often see that someone's desperate to sell the flat or maybe refinance for some change in circumstance in their life. So they'll do this informal lease extension right up to almost completing, almost signing the new deal. And then they'll say, actually, we made a mistake, or the price of the property's gone up now and we want £1,800 or £2,100 more, and they know that if you're in a chain or you need some finance or whatever, you've probably got no choice but to pay it. Again, nothing you can do legally. You're at the whim of the freeholder. So besides licenses and all those different things, there's a bag of tricks, and in fact we tried to keep this webinar quite short, but I do a webinar which is an hour long of this, and so it's much more detailed than this, but we're just trying to give you the sort of main points that you would consider. So be aware. And why should you be aware? You should be aware because usually for most of us, your flat is either one of your biggest assets or it's part of your portfolio for whatever else you choose to do later on in your life. And here you have some predatory, often even politely, a nice way of saying it is disingenuous freeholders who have this bag of tricks up their sleeve, all designed to get the most money they can possibly get out of you. Most freeholders are not your friends. They are professional freeholders, and if you're in any kind of doubt, then Google your freeholder or their managing agent who's putting you under this pressure, and put some quite horrible words after, like the name of your freeholder, unscrupulous, service charge disputes, or first tier tribunal, and see which cases they're involved in. And you'll be surprised to see how much information there is out there that is very critical of freeholders. We are very famous for taking a stand against informal lease extensions. I happen to believe that they are really immoral deals, and flat owners fall into them because of the chance of saving £1,500 today, and we all work hard for our money, but not understanding the future implications as your freeholder does. So if you make this decision and there's no financial interest in this, most of you watching this is a free webinar to go out to all of you. You're not clients of ours, and we have no interest in, no financial interest in you not doing this. But please think very, very carefully about the implications of this. You're very happy, we're very happy if you ever called us, even if you weren't one of our clients, and we would give you our professional opinion on any informal lease extensions you've been offered. You can call us anytime on 020-3327-1177, or you can email us at info@leaseholdsolutions.com. But please, if you make this decision, go in with your eyes open, and your freeholder will tell you, I'm not going to do any of these things, I'm not this kind of guy. But we see this day in and day out, and it doesn't matter what they say, once you've signed your new deal, it's your future. So good luck, and beware of freeholders bearing gifts.